Hello and welcome to this AQA online training. Inset Online are hosting the session, and in this short introduction we will show you how to use some of the features you may need today. My colleague Miroslava Koka will be your host and Kathy McVeigh your trainer. First of all, please can I check that you can all hear me? You should be able to see a poll on screen. If you can hear me, please click the button next to yes. Thank you. There are a number of ways that you can communicate with us today. The main way is via the chat windows that you will see on every screen. Thank you to those who introduced themselves in the chat window earlier. There are two types of chat window. The first, on the right of your screen, is titled Questions for your trainer and host. When you type into this window, your question will not be seen by other participants, but will come through to us in the background. Your trainer will answer your questions at specific points, so please don't expect an immediate response. If you have any general or technical questions, your host will help you. Please be aware that connection problems can be beyond our control. The second type of chat window is for sharing ideas with the whole group. Anything you type into these windows can be seen by other participants. At certain points today, you will be asked to vote in polls. I'd like to reassure you that polls are anonymous. Other participants will see how many people have voted for each option, but will not know who has voted for what. You can now see the results of the poll we asked earlier. During today's event, you will notice that some windows provide a full screen button in the top right-hand corner. Pressing this button will make the document full screen. To return to the normal view, simply press this button again. About halfway through today's training, there will be a 5-minute break. So now it is with great pleasure that I hand you over to your host Miroslava and your trainer Kathy, who will take you through today's training. Over to you, Kathy.
Thank you. Good evening and welcome to this AQA course on fundamental skills in A-level German. My name is Kathy McVeigh. I've worked for AQA for almost 30 years as an examiner moderator and team leader for GCSE writing. I'm the assistant principal examiner for speaking, and I've been a team leader for ASA2 and for the current AS and A-level. I'm a teacher at an 11 to 18 comprehensive, and so I really must say how I appreciate your commitment, giving up 2 hours after school, as I really do understand how hard everybody's working in these very difficult circumstances in which we as teachers find ourselves at the minute, so well done. Before I begin, I'd like to confirm that I will not be referring to future questions in today's training, and that is the case in all AQA training courses. Can I also emphasise that specimen papers and mark schemes, as well as student exemplars, are also freely available to teachers via the AQA website. So just before we get started, you're going to see some polls on screen. This will just give us an insight into the type of centres we're working with today and the degree of experience you all have. I'll just give you a moment to submit your answers. Thank you. Okay, so we can see that we've got a wide range of schools and colleges, and again a wide range of experience, and a couple of colleagues who were able to do the training with other colleagues from their school, which is also good as well. It means that you can share ideas. Okay, so if we could go back to the PowerPoint, please. So the aims of this webinar are to reinforce your understanding of the fundamental skills of A-level German and strengthen your confidence to support your students, particularly in those skills that students may not have developed during GCSE. To achieve these aims, we will revisit the fundamental skills of A-level German. We'll examine some student responses and how they were marked to questions that underpin these skills. We'll discuss how students can best demonstrate their ability in exams, and we'll consider the implications for you for teaching and learning. So what do we mean by fundamental skills? The fundamental skills of a subject are the skills that the students need to demonstrate to be successful in that subject. They're related to, but separate from, knowledge of the subject content. For A-level German, the fundamental skill areas that we'll be considering today are listening tasks that will require a response in German, translation-based tasks both into and from German, the essay writing skills for paper 2, and speaking skills with a particular emphasis on assessment objective 4. We'll look at the listening and translation in the first half of this webinar, Then roughly halfway, it was about 5:10 when I did this course yesterday, we'll have a 5-minute break and then move on to the essay and speaking skills. I'm very mindful of the fact that most teachers are moving around from classroom to classroom. So hopefully within this presentation, there'll be a few tasks that I can highlight as starter tasks that you could perhaps put together as a booklet that students can be working on while you're arriving at the lesson, wiping down your surfaces and sanitizing your hands as we're all doing at the moment. So I'm going to start with listening tasks then. So what's involved in this fundamental area? There are two different types of task: listening to a stimulus text and writing a summary in German, and listening to a stimulus text and writing verbal responses in German to comprehension questions. These are the listening tasks that students find most challenging, hence the decision to concentrate on these and not to consider the non-verbal true-false multi-choice type questions. Why are we exploring this aspect? Although both tasks involve listening and responding in German, the skills involved are very different. The assessment objectives in the tasks are not exactly the same. The listening and summary writing is assessed for the content of the response and for language, whereas the listening and writing verbal responses in German is only assessed for the content of the response. So we're going to look at the listening and summary writing task first. So this involves a complex range of skills. First of all, the students have to listen and identify the relevant content according to the bullet points provided in the task outline. They need to make notes in German on the relevant content, construct a summary in German that covers that relevant content, manipulate the language of the original source text, produce as accurate a piece of German as possible, and all this working within a total word count of 90 words. And then obviously they need to manage the time given to complete the task in a reasonable and realistic way. It's important to break down the component skills involved in the listening and summary task, and sharing this with students is a good idea. There's a lot to think about around this task, and understanding the complexity of it encourages students to think about how they tackle the task in the exam, and we'll look at a recommended approach later. So we're going to have a look at some responses. So on the screen you can see the listening summary task outline from paper 1 in June 2019. There are 7 points of information, and they account for the 7 marks for AO1, so for the content. And then there are 5 AO3 marks for the accurate manipulation of language. So you can look at the task there. You'll see written sort of in bold at the end of each bullet point is the number of details the candidate has to give, and that corresponds to the number of marks that can be awarded. And it's worthwhile pointing that out. On occasions there will be times where there might be 3 details that are given in the text that the students could include in their summary. They might only need to give 2. Being mindful of the fact that they've only got 90 words, it's important that they realise that they need to give the number of details that it says in the actual outline. Okay, and then a reminder that at the bottom they get 5 marks for their content, for their grammar, if you like, their language. So looking at the mark scheme for each of the bullet points, this is bullet point 1. Just a reminder at the pre-standardisation stage, so once the exam has been done but before the marking begins, the mark scheme is often added to and amended in light of what students have produced in the exam in terms of what might be accepted and what might be rejected. So you'll see on the mark scheme you've got certain words underlined. They are the key ideas that need to be included. Okay. And then sometimes there will be a reject column where usually if it's something that's too vague or a word missing. Just got a couple of questions come through. I think the first one I've just answered, is this marked for content only or also for language? If that is the summary, then obviously yes, there are 5 marks for the language as well. And then secondly, what happens if they write more than 90 words? the summary is marked up to the first natural break after 90 words. Anything after that is discounted. So moving back then, the second bullet point, you've got again the key ideas being underlined and certain ideas that were accepted, and then things that were rejected. So here's an example of one where a word was missed out. So the idea that there was no moment of silence, if they just mentioned the moment but didn't mention silence, then they didn't get the mark for that point. And then the third bullet point, again, key ideas all underlined. The things like in den neuen Bundesländern could also have been expressed as im Osten. That was accepted, but something written in the wrong tense wasn't, for example. Okay. So we're now going to have a look at student A's response to this question. If you've got the booklet downloaded, it's page 10 of your student responses booklet. But you'll see Miroslava is just putting that and the mark scheme on the screen, please. So what I'd like you to do is to read it, and then on the screen you'll see a poll where you can enter the content mark. Miroslava, if you could give control to the delegates so that they can scroll up and down through the mark scheme and the response, that would be great. So I'm going to give you around 3 minutes to do that, please. Thank you. So just the last sort of 10 seconds or so just to poll your mark if you want to. Somebody's just asked, is it including the language mark? No, this is just the mark for content, please. So if you've included language, you might want to just edit that. So this is just for the content. Okay, so you can hopefully see we've got a range of marks there from 6 down to 4. I think 4 was the lowest. So for the first bullet point, the student scores the first of the 2 marks referring to celebration, but they didn't mention, she didn't mention singing. For the second bullet point, the student scored both marks. I think one of the answers was in the accept column, but that was fine. So although the student goes on to answer the third bullet point, the information comes after the first natural break after 90 words, so that's after garb, and therefore cannot be credited. And when you see the ticked version in your post-event download, the commentaries, you'll see that there's a whole paragraph of information that just doesn't get any marks at all, and obviously wasted some of the words. So the total for A01 was 3 out of 7. A more disciplined approach to note-taking and selecting the relevant information would have enabled the student to score more marks. The student's use of language was very good, showing appropriate independence from the heard material. So there was examples, Sie glaubt, dass man blah 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 erinnern müssen, and sie verstand nicht, warum es blah 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 gab. Although there are some errors, such as müssen instead of muss, the overall level of accuracy and a mark out of 4 out of 5 was deserved in there. Okay, so can we have the student B response and mark scheme on the screen, please? Okay, so again, I'll just give you 3 minutes or so to consider your A01 mark out of 7. So just the content mark. Thank you. Okay, so just your last 30 seconds to poll your mark if you want to, please. Okay, thank you. So, although in this case the response as a whole was relevant as a summary of what the student had heard and did include some correct information, the student hadn't focused clearly enough on the bullet points. The only point that could be credited for AO1 is the reference to Kristallnacht. Elsewhere, key elements are missing, like we saw in the mark scheme, Schweigen was omitted from the phrase weil es keine Augenblick für Kristallnacht war, and the last two sentences were too vague. So that was 1 mark for content. Nevertheless, because the whole answer is relevant to the task, it was a summary of what they'd heard, the student can have the access to the full range of marks for AO3. So given the generally good level of accuracy and the varied use of grammatical structures, a mark on the boundary of 3 out of 5 or 4 out of 5 is deserved, and the latter mark was awarded, so 4 out of 5. So I think that's reassuring to a certain extent. If a student does misunderstand the bullet point or whatever, but can produce some good relevant German in that it is a summary of what they've heard, they can still get marks for the grammar, for the language. Okay, so if we could go back to the PowerPoint, please. Thank you. So if we, how can we support our students in this skill area? So we listed the various and many skills involved in this task on slide 8, and students may need some guidance on how to tackle the task in stages and in a methodical way. What clues for listening to the stimulus are provided in the bullet points? So in the one we've just looked at, the first bullet point included a verb in the perfect tense, so this targeted information about a past reaction. The word Anfang is also important, as there could potentially be references to later events in the passage which may not be relevant. The second bullet point refers to Politica, so students need to listen out for this word or a related word such as politisch. The key word in the third bullet point is pessimistisch, but this concept could be expressed in a variety of ways. So they should note the content points, first of all, without any attempt at manipulation. And once their notes have been completed, they should do a quick word count to see how close to 90 words this content already is. Just before I move on, there is a question. Is it correct that if they lift from the transcript, they will lose marks for the language? Yes. It's not that they lose marks, they won't gain marks for showing that they can manipulate the language. So they'll still get the content mark. So again, that's worth the students knowing as well. So once the students have noted down their content, they should then start to draft the summary. So manipulating the language doesn't mean trying to change the vocabulary of the original. So it's not about finding synonyms. It means constructing the summary using different structures to bring together into a paragraph of German the content that has been noted. This can be helped by first of all rephrasing the bullet points as well as using the content notes. For example, the first bullet point mentions Mauerfall. What does that actually mean? The student could then start their answer with als die Mauer gefallen ist, hat Frau Graminsky. And this is one of those starter tasks that I mentioned. You could have a bank or a booklet full of all of these bullet point type questions, not with the listening text. They don't have to listen to it, just the questions, and get them to, if you like, rearrange them to say how they could start their answer off. And straight away, before they've even looked at their content, they've got marks or they've shown that they can manipulate the language. It can also be helped if the content notes that they've made state directly what speakers have said. So in this case, ich habe mit den anderen gejubelt, even though the ich will need to be changed in the final answer. So in bullet point 1, Frau Graminsky in her second statement refers to her initial reaction and then to her later thought. The bullet point targets her initial reaction, so students have to be careful to listen out to things like that. There are, as I mentioned before, no need to find synonyms for the verbs like gejubelt and gesungen. The main opportunity for manipulation here is the change from the first person, because she was saying, well, I did this, I did that, to the third person. And the student could also begin the response with a subordinate clause, as we've just mentioned. Als die Mauer gefallen ist, hat Frau Kaminski, and so on. Bullet point 2. The answer comes from the second half of Frau Kaminski's second statement. In order to respond to the bullet point, students need to supply a suitable verb and manipulate the language of the recording. So, die Politiker dachten nicht an die Juden, die ermordet wurden. And bullet point 3, students need to pick out the relevant points from her last two statements, and there were opportunities for manipulation using the passive subordinate clause, man kann nicht sagen das, and so on. So that's what is meant by the manipulation. It's not about finding synonyms for the vocabulary. So using this staged approach in a lesson can be helpful to students to demonstrate how to use the bullet points to organize their note-taking and focus on understanding the relevant content. So looking at the bullet points, picking out the words that they might need to listen to before they start. Making notes in German without attempting to manipulate the language. Then, very importantly, word counting their notes to see where the notes are in relation to the target of 90 words. And then looking critically at their notes, particularly if they're near the 90, decide what language manipulation is needed, the first to the third person as we've seen in this particular task, and making sure that they identify the essential content that needs to be conveyed. Concentration on key points of grammar in lessons to improve their accuracy is vital. So we've seen here the third person formation of verbs in different tenses, different case endings, expressing things from in the passive from the active in the text or whatever. And again, that's another great starter. Lots of verbs in the first person, particularly the irregular ones, and they've got to change them to the third person. Again, that's something you could email to them, ahead of the lesson so that they can be getting on with it while you're arriving. So moving on to the second type of listening task requiring a written response in German. This skill area is less complex than summary writing. There's not the same level of demand in the written response, and there is no assessment of the use of language. Okay, so no grammar mark. Comprehension questions must, of course, be read and interpreted accurately. If appropriate, the relevant content can be lifted directly. They won't lose marks for that. Answers should be as brief as possible. Students don't always need to write full sentences. And again, you could use the mark schemes for that. Once you've done a question with them, look at the mark scheme and see where it was where they didn't need to actually write full sentences. So if we can have student response C on the screen, please. And Miroslava, if the delegates can have control so they can scroll up and down as we go through. So in the right hand side where the paper is, if you scroll down, you should also have the mark scheme, I believe. So you've got the transcript. No, you haven't. Oh yes, and there's the mark. Yes, you've got the mark scheme as well. Okay, so I'm just going to go through these answers. So for this first one then, 3.1, the correct answer is given in the first sentence. The grammatical errors do not impede the communication, so it could be understood, and the rest of the response can be ignored because it didn't negate what had already been said in the correct answer. 3.2 also got a mark. The correct answer is given. There was extra detail, but that could be ignored. 3.3 also got a mark. So despite the grammatical errors, the correct information is conveyed in the last part of the answer. 3.4, the 2 points have been combined into a single sentence, and that is absolutely fine, so both marks could be awarded. And then finally 3.5 didn't score anything. The response was confused and contradictory, so no mark was awarded there. Okay, so could we have a look at student response D, please? And so this is the same question with the same mark scheme. Again, you should be able to scroll up and down, please. So 3.1, the response given here doesn't match the question. The question asked wohin, so no mark was awarded. 3.2 also didn't score a mark. The student has located the correct part of the recording, but unfortunately by writing eigener instead of einiger, they hadn't conveyed the relevant information. Question 3, the correct answer was clearly given, so 1 mark. 3.4, again the 2 correct points were clearly conveyed. Student did go on to give further detail, but that could be ignored because it didn't contradict what they've already written. And finally in 3.5, this was the opposite to the correct answer. The student didn't appear to have grasped the contrast between the past and the present practice that is referred to in the recording, so that didn't score any marks. Okay, I know we've gone through that fairly quickly. You will get all of this in your the post-event materials, so you can have a look at those and how they were marked in a bit more detail if you need to. Okay, so if we could go back to the PowerPoint, please. Thank you. So how can we support students in this skill area? It's helpful for students to have guidance on accurately interpreting the written questions. So such guidance can focus on the clues provided in how a question is phrased. So what time frame is involved, what tense, and how will that affect how they have to phrase their answer. Using the questions alongside the transcript that the student follows whilst listening and highlighting the relevant bits of the text is a very useful task. I use transcripts a lot when I teach. I think they're vital, to help the students just get used to the sort of phonetic representation of some of the words, as well as looking at the actual task that they've got to do. Guidance on when it is appropriate to respond briefly or when a full sentence is needed is helpful, and again use the mark scheme with students to illustrate this. And a short listening task based on a stimulus read by the teacher with just a couple of questions to answer is a useful starter activity in a lesson. Of course, that's once you're there, but that is, it doesn't have to be a long text, it doesn't have to be a full question, and it could be linked into a particular bit of AO4 knowledge which will help them with their speaking, which you'll see when we come on to that later. So how can students be supported in improving listening skills generally? So there's 2 types of activities you can do. There's transcription-based activities. So you can have a listening with a gap fill, with the gaps based on phonetically significant words, words that sound very different from their equivalents in English. You can have a gap fill with gaps based on the words that are significant in terms of the meaning for the text and the task that they've got to do. And then you could have short transcriptions with no spaces between the words that students have to first of all make sense of by dividing the words up and then rewrite them when they hear the text. I think that's good. I think that's very good right the way down. I could see myself using that with my lower ability key stage 3 students who struggle with listening. Revision and independent study is going to be particularly important in the current circumstances with the amount of work that students have missed during lockdown. Students could record an audio vocabulary in addition to a written one, and so they're listening to the words as well as looking at them when they revise. So they could just record these onto their phones, or it could be a recorded PowerPoint that they produce, or indeed that you could produce with the keywords that they need. They can use online German pronunciation resources to help with this, and again this could be a starter task. You guide them to one that you think is a good one. You can Google these, there are several out there, and that could just be a starter task that they can do if your school allows it, be doing on their phones while they're waiting for you to arrive. Listening to YouTube clips and using them as a basis for a dictation exercise, again that could be something that you set for them that they could possibly do through their phones. And YouTube clips of German songs with the lyrics displayed. I'm sure you've all heard the Wise Guys. I think they're fantastic. They've got some great songs. There's a lovely one about mobile phones, some quite good ones that are particularly good for the AS topics. and they are very useful, and they're quite up-tempo, and the kids like them as well. So that concludes the listening skills section. We're going to move now on to translation. So this fundamental skills in translating from English into German, can't really be separated from their knowledge of grammar and syntax. Additionally, a knowledge of where the German language differs from or is similar to English is essential for accurate and successful translation. With the support of that knowledge, one fundamental skill is recognizing how something expressed in English is accurately and authentically conveyed in German. Likewise, the ability to select appropriate structures and words required from for a translation task from their grammatical and lexical knowledge of German is a fundamental skill. And specific to the nature of this task in A-level languages, there's also the skill of identifying and manipulating appropriate items of language from a source text that they can use in the translation task. So why we're exploring this aspect then? The translation from English into German carries 10 marks for AO3, so a significant number of marks, and students should obviously aim to achieve as high a mark as possible. The mark out of 10 is determined by the number of accurately translated boxes of text. So the text is divided up into chunks, and they get a mark for each chunk. Each box of text warrants careful thought, so that the points of language tested are properly understood. So the focus here is on encouraging students to understand the nature of the task they're undertaking, so recognizing, if you like, what the examiner is testing in each box. And this understanding can significantly affect how the student performs in this task, and I'll illustrate this in the following slides. So this was the translation in June 2019. So you can see down the left hand side you've got the individual boxes of text, 1 mark for each one. So if we just go through these, if you want, obviously they've got a choice of du, sie, ihr and man, and all of those would be acceptable, but whichever form they choose, they must try and use that consistently throughout the translation, other than man, where sometimes man might be used and combined with something else if it's being used to avoid a passive, for example. To stay in Germany, basic spellings here, the SCH, the EIIE type thing. So again, that should be something that students are used to looking for and spotting and thinking about. Certain words that are just basic vocabulary, so have gained. Good language skills, that was in the source text, but they need to know the adjective endings before a plural noun. The use of the nominative case in the start of the sentence, this course, and we're going to see these a lot. Verbs that take a particular case, in this case helfen. So again, if students are aware of those, they'll see that as a trigger, if you like, and think, right, I need to think about what case that uses. To prepare for, again, reflexive verbs and the correct preposition using auf, and you'll see that again and again and again. The verb sich vorbereiten is given in the source text, but in a different form, so again that manipulation comes in. The formation of compound nouns with the world of work. Flüchtlinge was given in the source text, so it's spotting what's there for them already. Impersonal verbs, in this case we've got gelingen with the dative case. Again, you will see impersonal verbs come up a lot. And then the appropriate choice of words. So in this case, we've got jobs here. You've got different words that they could use, so they've got to be able to make and distinguish between why one will be better than the other. By taking part, that should flag up to a student that they need to try and use in dem. Taking part in our program, you've got a verb followed by the dative case, or and plus the dative case. So again, the students need to know those verbs, know the prepositions, what cases they take, and sort of recognize those as soon as they see them in the box. Another one where you've got a choice of words with know, wissen or kennen. Do they know the difference? And then again, we'll see this a lot, how to use noch. Okay, in this case, noch nicht. Which career? That was given in the text, but obviously they have got other alternatives if they didn't spot that. And here again with suits you best, we've got another verb with a that's used with a particular case. So again, they have got to think and know those and recognize those. The future tense, in this case, you'll be able to try out. Again, ausprobieren was given in the text in the present tense. They need to know how to change from something in the present tense to an infinitive, and again, I think we see that later on as well. Verschiedene was given in the source text. The knowledge of Möglichkeiten was being tested. That interests you, use of relative clauses, and again, interessieren plus a certain case. So again, you can see now you need to be giving your candidate, your students, the lists of verbs, what cases they take, what prepositions they use, and so on. Another example of a verb that was given in the source text, herausfinden, but it was in the present tense. So again, that's another one of these starter tasks that you could have ready, that students just have in a booklet that they work through. Verbs in the present tense, convert them to the infinitive. Okay, strengths was given in the text, weaknesses wasn't. Another verb with the dative case. I think even from this translation you've got quite a long list here of verbs that you can be giving them to learn. Mit with the dative plural, that was one that my students a couple of years ago always seemed to lose marks on. It just seemed such a silly error to make. All this, so you've got verb endings here with adjectives, dies, alles, all das, whichever way they choose. Without paying, that's sort of like a standard phrase they need to know. Ohne with the infinitive and zu. Euro was not well known. The word was, the gender wasn't. The course here had already been tested, so a repeat error. So if they got the gender wrong in that, I think it was the third or the fourth box, but get it wrong again, they won't be penalised. So it's an NFP, a no further penalty. And obviously this is testing the formation of the passive. 4 times a year, 2 alternatives they could have given there. Places, again, the appropriate choice of word for places. And then finally, and again very badly done, this was the command form of a reflexive verb. But even just command forms, again, they need to know those. Okay, so if we could have a look at student response E, please. So Miroslava, if the delegates can have control so they can scroll through. Again, you've got the translation and the mark scheme, and then the student response. And what I'm going to do is just go through it with you and explain why the students did or didn't get the marks in this case. So you might want to have the mark scheme that you can look at in the right hand window, and then the response. So box 1, student used lowercase on Z, so didn't get the mark. Only the excuse me, the first occurrence of an error with a lower or uppercase will be penalised, and that applies for nouns as well. So if they don't use a capital letter on a noun all the way through, they'll only be penalised for it once. Box 3, they used the wrong vocabulary with Fähigkeiten. They got the gender of Kurs wrong. The case of the personal pronoun for box 6, they use Sie instead of Ihnen. Box 7, they use fertig machen. Box 10, the verb tense was wrong and erfolgreich was used incorrectly. And box 11, they used Beruf for jobs. Box 12, they didn't manage the in dem clause. Box 13, the case ending and spelling mistakes there. Box 14, they didn't have verb second idea, and they said nicht jetzt instead of noch nicht. 15, the gender and case ending with welcher Beruf. 16, the wrong choice of verb, fallen. And then a couple of good bits, and then box 19, the position of für, I think it was Sie sich für interessieren. Vocabulary and word order for box 20, finden. We've got schwachen without the umlaut. The wrong case with bieten, so bieten Sie. Vocabulary, they used the wrong word from the source text for applications. They couldn't do the allerdings, whatever I think was what they wrote. The omission of zu without after ohne, and also, as I mentioned earlier on, the gender of euro was not well known at all. Box 27, dauert, wasn't considered to be precise enough for this in translation. 29, platzen without the umlaut, and in box 30 they used the infinitive instead of a command form, and they missed the reflexive pronoun. So this candidate got 8 ticks altogether. That then converts in the mark scheme to a total of 3 marks out of 10. Okay, so if we could have a look at student response F, please. Okay, again, if you have a look at the mark scheme and then scroll down through the response as I go through it. So box 3, the word order was wrong, haben was in the wrong place. Box 5, the gender of Kurs, the handwriting was unclear. Was it meant to say dieses or dieser? And it's worthwhile reminding you, your students, that these are read on a screen, so they're sort of scanned in, and the examiner reads them on a screen. So it is really important that they make their handwriting as clearly as possible, as clear as possible. Box 7, the vocabulary and the verb construction fertig machen. Box 8, the vocabulary, this Berufsraum. Box 9, they used the wrong case with gelingen. And box 10, there you had a plural instead of a singular verb, so sind gelungen. Box 11, the problem was the vocabulary. So the use of bei was okay, but it was beim Arbeitssuch without any sort of e or anything. Box 12, the vocabulary and the sentence structure, von Teilnahme. And then following on from that, the wrong preposition with Teilnahme or Teilnehmen. Box 14, noch, was omitted again. 15, welcher Beruf, the gender and the case ending. Box 16, this was a vocabulary thing. They had to say about something suiting them. They had a go at it by using gefällt. It was classed that was a different meaning. It didn't mean the same thing. It was a paraphrase, really. They used viele instead of verschiedene in their thing about possibilities. Box 19, sich instead of sie. Box 20, the vocabulary in the possessive adjective ihren. 21, again schwachen with the umlaut missing. The formation of the compound noun for job applications, Arbeitsbewerbungen. Alle instead of alles, and then they omitted either a das or dies. 26, the incorrect use of Pflicht, and again the gender of Euro. 27, the verb form, they used lauft, so again the umlaut missing, so that's those irregular verbs that they need to get to know. 29, the plural of Platz was wrong, and then again in 30, the reflexive pronoun was omitted. So again, this student had 22 boxes not credited, total ticks 8, and that converted to 3. Okay, so again, run through that quite quickly. You can go through that in the post-event materials yourself with the commentary there, just to see. It might be sort of a useful exercise to do with students once they've had a go at doing this. Let them have a go at marking it with the mark scheme perhaps, and possibly that would flag up the sort of errors that they are making but that other people make as well. So if we could go back to the mark scheme, please. Sorry, to the PowerPoint, please. So how can we support students in this? So looking first of all at the support for your group as a whole, we need to ensure that grammar teaching and learning target key areas of language. So secure knowledge of tenses and common irregular verbs. We saw that with the lauft there, for example. English tenses, the simple and the continuous, and their German equivalents. The use and, where necessary, the avoidance of the passive voice, and the formation and use of impersonal verbs. Again, we saw quite a few in there that they need to know and be confident to use. They need secure knowledge of common case endings and how the cases are used, secure knowledge of their word order, and then regular practice excuse me, in transferring from one subject to another, and the manipulation of verb forms, including separable and reflexive verbs and the emphasis on endings. So again, I mentioned the idea of giving them a conjugated verb and they've got to get to the infinitive. But again, first to third person to first person, things like that. Verb constructions with prepositions that are different from English. So we saw there sich vorbereiten auf, an awareness of common idiomatic expressions. Linked to that, potential pitfalls when translating from English, so how English behaves and how German behaves differently. We see that really with the GCSE photo card, ist spielen, and things like that. So basic things like that can be very important. Sentences in both languages used as parallel texts so that significant differences can be spotted and reinforced. And if you are doing a literary text that has a translation, you might find chunks in there that you could use. Helps them with their understanding of their literary text, of course, but it might highlight where there are differences in the way that things are expressed in English and in German. They need to know common adverbs, prepositions, conjunctions, and potential pitfalls with umlaut. Again, we saw that with lauf, läuft, schwache, schwächer, and so on. Singular and plural forms and getting these right, and I think that's vital that students get used to learning both the singular and plural verbs forms of vocabulary when they're doing it, and again including those on their audio vocabularies when they're recording things. And then basic manipulation tasks between a source text and a sentence to translate, so that optimum use is made of the source text and the clues it contains. And again, you could do this as a starter task. So based on a text, on a topic that you're doing at the moment, give them a sentence based on that involves them manipulating some of the language, maybe changing from a plural to a singular, or a conjugated verb to an infinitive. And again, a bank of those that you could have that the students can be working through as you arrive is ideal. Careful reading of the source text is needed, and I work on this with students before telling them they're going to use it for a translation. They're very tempted to go straight to the translation without looking at the text and how they can use it. They shouldn't assume that they can just lift from it. They must know that they've got to try and manipulate the language. So they should check whether the source text does or doesn't match what the sentence requires. So does a singular need to be made plural? Is there a change of subject with a verb that therefore needs a different ending? Is there a change of tense? Is the case ending in the text the same as for the translation, and so on? And again, careful analysis of that before they start translation is important. They must think really carefully about the items that are not provided and make sure they get the right words. So we saw that with the word jobs there, wissen, kennen, things like that. So you can devise simple language transfer tasks based on text used in your lesson to encourage regular practice in manipulating language. So if you've finished a text either from the transcript or a reading, just give them a couple of sentences to translate back into German from that. Looking at how individuals can be supported, there are self-help resources, and again, it is going to be vital that students are doing this to catch up from last year. There are lots of online grammar practice exercises. Again, you might need to guide them to that, things that are appropriate. Use of individual error profiles are vital. So students are supported and guided in identifying and logging points of language where, for them individually, errors commonly occur. So these can serve as improvement targets in future assignments. And the error profile then becomes a checklist for careful reading of boxes of text. So if they know that they always make mistakes, as I said with my students with the dative plural, the first thing that they look for when they're going through those boxes is there a dative plural there? Is there an infinitive there, or something like an zu or an ohne zu, where I know I always miss the zu out. So they almost, if you like, annotate the boxes of text before they start, using the errors that they know that they commonly make or regularly make. And then at the end of it, they can use this error profile as a checklist for checking their accuracy and correcting as necessary. So moving on to the translation from German into English then. So these are linked to AO2, so that is understanding and responding in writing to written language drawn from a variety of sources. The translation requires detailed understanding, including the recognition and accurate transfer into English of both grammatical structures and lexical items. So again, a knowledge of where German language differs from or is similar to English is essential for accurate and successful translation. And with the support of that knowledge, one fundamental skill is recognizing how something expressed in German is accurately and authentically conveyed into English. The translation from German into English carries 10 marks for AO2. Again, a significant number of marks, and students should aim to achieve as high a mark as possible. Again, this is divided up into boxes of text that need to be accurately translated. So each box of text warrants careful thought, so that the points of language tested are properly understood, so that they recognise that something is a passive or a future or whatever. And this understanding can significantly affect how the student performs in this task, and this is illustrated in the slides on the question from last year. So again, it's divided up into 20 boxes. So the observations on how this was handled, excuse me, I'll just take a sip of water, excuse me. So in 2019, 70er Jahre was sometimes translated as the 60s, and in der was sometimes omitted. Classical often used instead of classic. Sometimes the perfect tense in the ist geschrumpft here was mistaken for an English style continuous present. So again, recognizing that perfect tense. Wie noch nie cause widespread difficulty, and again, all these little phrases with noch are vital that students get used to them. Some students wrongly put the verb entscheiden sich into the past tense, so again, that's the knowledge of their strong and irregular verbs, those verb tables. Ablehnen, a basic vocabulary thing students didn't always know, similarly with Muster, and also with stattdessen, sometimes getting muddled up with in the town. Most students realised that Lust, nach Lust und Laune was an idiom, but a few people took Lust to mean lust. A few problems with Es steht nicht fest. Not all students recognised the comparison there, glücklicher. Most students knew Schlüssel, but a lot of people didn't get Zufriedenheit. Few problems with das die beiden Partner, you'd hope, but so caused difficulty in this context, and again, it's these little words that students need to be familiar with. Some students omitted voll in that sentence there. The construction starting with wer, a lot of students translated it inappropriately as who, and again, students struggling with the impersonal use of fallen, so these impersonal verbs again, and some using the conditional instead of the future. The last little bits didn't cause too many problems, although Sichtweise wasn't particularly well known. So, sorry. I'm going to have a look at two responses. So if we have student response G on the screen, please. So again, I'm going to go through these, so you might want to have a look at the mark scheme so you can see as I go through it. So in box 2, Anzahl was wrongly translated. Box 4, so. Muster was wrongly translated, and nach Lust und Laune in box 9. In box 14, the translation didn't really convey the meaning of the German accurately enough. They put are content with the situation. That wasn't considered to be. It was too much of a paraphrase, but not really a translation. 17 and 19, as we said, the leichter fallen, the use of fallen impersonally has been misunderstood, and das durchzuziehen was misunderstood. So again, this candidate got 13 ticks, and that corresponded to a mark out of 7 out of 10. Okay, so if we could have student response H on the screen, please. Okay, so similar type of thing here. Classical conveyed the wrong meaning. In box 4, so was wrongly translated. In box 5, they put haven't decided, so got the wrong tense of entscheiden. Box 6, pairs wasn't accepted, and nor was idea in box 7. Another problem with nach Lust und Laune. And in box 14, the translation of so was omitted. Box 15, the wrong verb tense. Box 16, wer, so that, as we mentioned, was wrongly translated. And then boxes 17 and 19, the impersonal use of fallen and durchzuziehen were both misunderstood. So this candidate got 9 ticks correct, which corresponded with 5 marks. And again, you will have these in your post-event material, so you can have a look at them in a bit more detail yourself. Okay, so could we go back to the PowerPoint, please? So how can we support students in this aspect? Well, the most obvious thing, but sometimes things that students seem to ignore or overlook, is that the original German passage makes sense. So if students read what they've written and it doesn't make sense, then it's wrong. So encourage students to avoid a literal translation, but equally to avoid paraphrasing or giving an approximate rendering. Emphasize the need to read the text carefully, paying attention to the time frame in which it is written and to the range of tenses used. And again, that knowledge of the regular and irregular verbs is vital here. Expose students to plenty of pitfall tense forms, compound tenses with sein, so that the accurate translation becomes second nature. And again, rote learning, also rote practice if you like, drilling that, again, 10 or so sentences at the start of a lesson that you give them at the end of the previous lesson. This is your starter for next time. Focus on the accurate translation of words that can be easily overlooked, and we saw in those 2 student examples there, so, noch, zu, aber, those little words that do add a little bit to the meaning and indeed can change the meaning in some cases. So the translation of any text is a necessary step towards a detailed understanding. So translation of relevant extracts, e.g. from a multiple choice source text, something from one of the papers, or any reading comprehension text that comes up in your textbook, will support accurate interpretation of the text. So encourage students to translate what they're confident they understand, and then use this to make an informed guess of the meaning of what they do not understand. Make sure you expose students to common false friends. So like the example here, we've got Lust in this paper. Encourage students to work out the meaning of compound nouns and verbs from their parts. And again, that is something you could have as a starter, a whole series of compound nouns, and they've got to try and guess the meaning. Obviously linked to the topics that you're doing. And then expose students and encourage them to research word families. So trennen, Trennung, getrennt, and make this sort of activity as competitive as possible. So we're going to have a 5-minute break now. So if you can be back at your screens at 9 minutes past, please, that would be great. Thank you. Okay, welcome back. So we're going to move on now to the essay writing skills. Just wait for the right PowerPoint to be back on. So could we have the PowerPoint, please, Miroslava? Thank you. So, essay writing skills cover a number of aspects. In an exam situation, it is crucial that the students manage their time effectively. Choosing between two questions for each text or film requires careful thought, and understanding or unlocking the question is a particular skill that can significantly affect the mark achieved. Planning a response that is relevant to the specific question chosen is a key skill, and writing as linguistically accurate a response as possible is also a fundamental skill, and each of these will be looked at in more detail. So, effective time management is vital. In 2 hours, the student has to respond to 2 questions. The time should be divided equally across the 2 essays, and it is crucial that students keep to this equal allocation of time. Students should consider the optimum way of using the 1 hour allocated to each essay. Many students see the task of writing an essay as a bit of a race against the clock and are eager to put pen to paper immediately and start on their answer, and this isn't the most effective approach to take. Time at the start should be set aside for careful consideration of the choice of questions and for very detailed planning. In writing a paper 2 essay in German, it's the quality of the response, not the quantity of pages filled, that will achieve higher marks. And I'm sure you've all heard, like me, heard students come back in, yeah, I wrote 3 pages, or I wrote 4 pages, as if that is a sign that they've done well. So questions need to be read fully and carefully, and the key points noted. The question prompt may include a command word, and each command word carries a specific meaning, and the essay must clearly reflect these. So here's some examples from paper 2, June 2019. So you've got untersuchen Sie, bewerten, analysieren, erklären, and it's worthwhile going through those with students, not just for the book and the texts that you're actually studying, but from all of them, to look at the types of questions that they could get asked. Okay, so for all the books and all the texts that are on the papers, just go through those and make sure that they are absolutely familiar with what they actually mean and what the question requires. Students invariably enter the exam room hoping to see a particular question on the paper, and this can have a negative effect on how they read a question. So i.e. what they see influences how they misinterpret a question. Often they don't read beyond the triggers they want to see. They see the green and not the red. So you've got some examples of questions here where, for example, in the Leben der anderen one, they see the word hero, but they don't actually see that they've got to do a bigger, that he is a bigger hero than Wiesler, for example. Okay, they don't see the and with what success. They just talk about how language and comedy is used in whichever film it was, but don't refer to the what success. Okay, so they must get used to reading the question that is there, not sort of thinking, yeah, I did this one last week. Another type of question is an opinion about the work and an invitation for the student to judge the validity of the opinion. And again, get them used to these phrases in bold that, again, go through all the questions across all the different set texts and films from the past papers, and get them used to recognizing, right, this means I've got to have an opinion about it. They can either agree or disagree, or agree and disagree. So there's no right or wrong answer, if you like. The key point is that whatever they say, they justify it with evidence from the book or the film. So planning a response that is relevant to the question. This is absolutely crucial. There's a close correlation between essays that are well planned and essays that score high marks. The more detailed the planning, the more thoughtful and relevant the response. The recommended planning time for each essay is 20 to 25 minutes. Now, the first time I did a similar course to this a few years ago when I was delivering it, and I read that and I thought, wow, 25 minutes, that's nearly half the time. But I sort of followed that through with my own students, and the essays that they produced were infinitely better. A lack of planning often leads to a poorly presented essay. Detailed planning in German reduces the time needed to write the essay because they've already written some of the stuff out. And detailed planning reduces the amounts of crossing out of sentences or sometimes whole paragraphs, reduces the need to put stars or asterisks in the margin and write additional points at the end of the essay. And again, it's worthwhile reminding students, like I mentioned earlier, that their work is scanned in, if you like, and it appears as clips on a screen. So the examiner has to sort of scroll through different screens to read the essay. If they're then having to go to the end and then somehow go back to find where a particular piece of paragraph that they've fitted in at the end then fitted in earlier in the essay, it doesn't mean that it flows particularly well. It's not very easy to read. A well-planned essay will guide the reader through clearly expressed, logically developed points supported by well-selected evidence. An essay that has been carefully planned has a better of showing that their knowledge of the text of film is accurate, detailed, that they can use appropriate evidence from the film or the text to justify their points of view, develop arguments, draw conclusions, and that all of that is based on their understanding of the film. And that is what they need to do to have an excellent critical and analytical response to the question. So the 40 marks awarded for each essay is 20 marks for AO4 and 20 marks for AO3. So 20 marks for their content and 20 marks for their language. So 80 marks in total, and that is 20% of the marks for the whole A level. And that clearly can have a significant impact, either positively or negatively, on the final outcome. The guidance presented here applies to both questions on the paper. They're both assessed to the same mark scheme and the same assessment criteria. But improvement in the skills that we're going to go through is very much in the control of the student. So we're going to have a look at student I's response to question 10. It's page 37 if you've got it in the student responses booklet downloaded. So if we could have student I on the screen, please. So what I would like you to do is to read the essay, and for AO4, that's the content, decide which band you would initially put this response into. Is it, in your opinion, very limited, limited, reasonable, or very good? And once you've done that, I'll ask Miroslava to bring another poll up that will allow you to fine-tune your marks. So first of all, if you can just decide which band you're going to put it into. I'm going to give you about 6 minutes to read that. Hopefully you've had the chance to read this beforehand. And you can scroll down, obviously scroll down through the script and scroll down through the mark scheme. So we're looking at just the content mark, please. Okay, thank you. Okay, the last sort of 20 seconds or so if you just want to poll your mark, please. Okay, thank you. Well, that one was placed in the limited band. So what I would like, Miroslava, if you would bring up the next poll, if you'd now like to poll where you think you would have put it within that band. Okay, so you've got a range of marks between 8 and 5. Okay, so just a minute or so to do that. I'm conscious of time. Okay, so I think most of you have done that, so I'll just go through the commentary for that one then. So the opening paragraph sets the scene by stating Hannah's past crime and the internal conflict that she therefore experiences. The last clause in that paragraph is unclear. The theme of conflict is developed in the second paragraph, where the student mentions Hannah's illiteracy for the first time, but the sentence "es kann" finishing with probieren is unclear. The third paragraph focuses on part 2 of the novel. Again, there's a lack of clarity in places, especially the clause "und macht ihre selbst verbergen." The student explains correctly how Hannah learnt to read while in prison, before making the valid but contextually awkward point that Hannah's suicide is a metaphor for her weakness. In the final paragraph, the student focuses on Hannah's guilt and explains how her guilt increases during the novel. While the references in the essay are mostly accurate and the communication of ideas is mostly clear, the essay does not address the question clearly enough. A stronger response would place Hannah's illiteracy at the centre of the discussion and evaluate how her illiteracy affects her actions and destiny. So mention could be made of the fact that Hannah's illiteracy affected her promotion prospects and also has consequences in the courtroom. On the other hand, Hannah is proud of her achievement in learning to read while in prison. So examiners work through the mark scheme descriptors from the lowest to the highest band of marks, assessing for AO4, so for the content first of all. This answer is definitely better than very limited, but there's not quite enough here to justify reasonable. It belongs in the top half of the 5 to 8 band, and 7 was awarded, which a few of you did give, so well done there. Okay, so you've also now got on the screen question 7.1, paper 2 from June 2019 on Kafka. So if we could have student J's response on the screen, please, Miroslava. Yeah, that's it. Thank you. So again, you've got, you should have the question in the right hand box, and then scroll down, you'll have the mark scheme. And student J, what I'd like you to think about in this one, answer the question, is this answer significantly better than the one that we just looked at? Okay, so decide which band you want to place the student in, and then we'll have a look at fine-tuning the mark afterwards. Okay, so again, about 6 minutes for this. Thank you. Okay, last 30 seconds then please to put your money where your mouth is and poll your mark. Okay, so I think this is a classic essay, one that sort of flatters to deceive a little bit because the quality of the language was considerably better than the previous student. This was or fitted into the 9 to 12 band for AO4. So I haven't broadcast the results of your poll, but we went from some people giving it excellent, some people giving it limited. So it was put in the 9 to 12 band. So Miroslava, if you would bring up the other little poll then please. So could you now decide where you would put it within that 9 to 12 band, please? Again, just 20 seconds or so just to do that. Interesting that a lot more of you vote when you've got a smaller window of numbers to choose from. Okay, so go through the commentary and then you'll see how the mark was awarded. The student begins with a brief summary of the work and goes on in the second paragraph to explain the bad aspects of Gregor's professional life. The information is generally accurate, although the meaning was sometimes clouded by wrong words such as unbearlich and fließenden. In the next section, the student explains Gregor's difficult family situation and goes on to comment on the frustration that Gregor feels by not being able to make himself understood. Again, there's some lack of clarity. Der Hauptgrund von Gregors unglückliche Weise. That's strange. In the final paragraph, the student focuses on the sad end to Gregor's life in which he feels alone and worthless. So it was classed to fit into the 9 to 12 band because the knowledge of the text of the film was generally accurate and fairly detailed, and the essay demonstrates reasonable evaluation of the relevant themes. However, the student doesn't mention possible optimistic elements, such as Gregor's demise symbolizing a new beginning for the Samsa family, and the effect that, for example, it had on his sister. And at times the link to the title is not as explicit as it should be. As I said before, the quality of language was significantly better than the content. And again, that should hopefully reassure you that they are marked separately. So it was given overall 10 marks for AO4, but 16 marks out of 20 for the language. Okay, so what it lacked in content, it made up for by the excellent German. And again, I think that's one of the things it did flatter to deceive a little bit when you actually looked at what he wrote, and in a way the omissions as well. That was why it came down a little bit lower on the AO4 mark. Okay, so if we could go back to the PowerPoint then, please. Thank you. So how can we support students in writing essays? So in this current year, with the amount of time that you've lost in delivering content, test essays in timetable lessons might not be a prudent strategy for your lessons. It may be possible to claim some study period time for timed practiced essays, but you should also encourage students to do essay assignments at home within 1 hour. You should set essay assessments in 2 stages to emphasize the benefits of that detailed planning. So, for example, your first homework might be that they submit a detailed plan in German, and then after discussion of that, you going through it with them, they then draft the essay. Discuss questions with students and identify keywords. Ensure the specifics of a question are understood, and then set the planning task to help them with their exam techniques. So get them really to analyse and unlock that question, and as we said, not just go for what they think they want to see. Give students judgment statements or opinion statements about a character, a theme, a development in the narrative, or a technical or stylistic aspect, and ask them to present the evidence to justify the statement or refute the statement, or both. And again, that's another great starter task. Little bit of preparation on your part, but again, all the different characters from the book with an opinion, and they've got to find the evidence. I tended to use the various different versions. PEEL we used to do, point, evidence, explanation and link, which they may have done at Key Stage 3 English, where they make the point, they find the evidence for it, they explain why that evidence proves the point, and then they link that back to the sentence, to the title. And again, that gave them a nice way of planning each of the points in their essays. Language profiling, similar to what we did in the translation to address their errors for AO3, is important as well. Pre-learnt sort of any answer introductions that provide lengthy explanations of the origins of work, details about the author or the director, a summary of the themes and or the characters are unnecessary. Their relevance to the question is dubious, and they'll usually not warrant any ticks for content, and they can actually result in an essay going off the point. An introduction that gets straight to the question and shows the question that has been clearly understood is a best practice introduction. And again, another starter task: give the students the title and ask them to write an introduction, not writing the rest of the essay, but how they would introduce their ideas, if you like, about that question. This came up yesterday about quotations. They're not given any extra credit, and it's better not to use them for two reasons. Having gone to the trouble of learning them, students will use them whether they're relevant or not, so they'll try and shoehorn them in. And a significant number of quotations are often written inaccurately, so that can sometimes affect their marks. Okay. I've just got a question about the number of serious errors. I don't want to dwell on that too much now. What I would suggest is that if you look at the mark scheme, it does go through what we class as serious errors and what are classed as minor errors. And obviously those two are balanced out. So it might just have crept into that 16 band, but it is balanced out between the major errors and the minor errors, and they are outlined in the mark scheme. So the last section then is looking at speaking skills, and particularly AO4. So the focus here is on the skills that the students can develop independently to improve their performance in the speaking exam. Such skills are linked to those aspects of the speaking performance over which the students have control. The skills are to do with their preparation for the speaking test to ensure that the students achieve the best possible performance on the day. And what we're going to look at here are AO2 on the stimulus card and AO4 on the stimulus card, the IRP presentation and the IRP discussion. So while we're looking at this, the combined score for AO2 and AO4 in the discussion of the sub-theme is 10 out of 25. So again, if they can bank that almost before they go in, they're doing well. The combined score for AO4 in the presentation, it's 5, and in the IRP it's 10, so a combined score of 15 altogether. So that these aspects account for 25 out of the 60 marks available in the speaking test. So nearly half. So we're going to look first of all at the stimulus card. So how can the students most effectively use their 5 minutes preparation time? It's unrealistic to think that they can write full detailed response to 3 questions, having spent the time choosing which card they're going to do and reading the card in just 5 minutes. So they need some shortcut strategies. The first thing that students need to be made aware of is what the 3 questions are. So question 1 is designed to assess the student's understanding of the material actually on the card. It can be quite a general way, or it can be something very specific, as you've got in the 2 examples there. Question 2 is designed to elicit a personal reaction to that information. And question 3 is designed to open up the discussion to broader aspects of that sub-theme in the context of Germany, Austria or Switzerland. So students must be aware that question 1 is to do with the content on the card and not an invitation to demonstrate their AO4 knowledge and understanding. So if when they're in their preparation time, the content on the card on first reading is understood and the student can process the information given without need to write too much down, there's little point in them making notes. They should be methodical in how they deal with the content. They must always start with the heading above the image. That can give them a lot of information. They don't gain any marks for describing what's in the picture, and then they should address the content of the text underneath the image. They don't need to communicate statistics in precise detail. They could say something like, almost half if it was 48.6. The question 1 relates closely to the card so that the student can experience a confident start to the test. And you can increase this confidence by having appropriate communication pegs on which they can hang their responses. So things like es geht auf diese Karte handelt es sich and so on. Just if they're confident with those phrases so they go in, it can help. They are key phrases for processing and communicating the information given. However, I would urge you to exercise caution when using idioms with specific meanings, such as the 2 that you've got there, and we hear these an awful lot. They're not always used appropriately, but they can sound very false if they're used out of context. So those of you who are old as me will remember Der Deutsche Aufsatz, a little blue book, which had loads of phrases, and when we used to have to write our discussion essays, I would try and shoehorn all of these ridiculous sounding phrases in. So try and avoid that, really. So if the student doesn't address key aspects of the content on the card, then you as a teacher or examiner must direct attention to these aspects. And if you don't do that, you will personally affect the mark awarded for AO2. So what I mean by that is, if a student has missed a chunk of statistics out or some bullet points, then ask follow-up questions to the things that they haven't referred to. And that is very important to ensure. The 5 minutes then now, if they've looked at question 1, fairly confident with that, they can now look at question 2 and question 3. So in making notes for question 2, it's either an opinion about the card or a reaction to it. They should consider the content of the card in the context of what they've learned or what they know about the sub-theme. So if the card deals with the sub-theme from the perspective of a German-speaking country other than Germany, the student could compare that perspective with what they know about Germany. So it might be, statistics about marriage and divorce in Austria. They could then compare it to Germany. If the card deals with the sub-theme from the perspective of Germany, then the student could compare that with what they know about Austria or Switzerland. So straight away they're producing, using their question 2 as an opportunity to express something other than just surprise or that they find something interesting, but also they're demonstrating their knowledge of the target language countries, so that is their AO4 knowledge. In preparing question 3, this is the one that it will lead to a more general discussion and is always phrased to elicit knowledge and understanding of those target language countries. So the notes can be the briefest of bullet points, but they can be valuable prompts for engaging in the discussion. There need to be quick references to aspects of the sub-theme linked to a German-speaking country, ideally going beyond the scope and knowledge and understanding covered in the textbooks. The first year we heard an awful lot about Oktoberfest and Dinner for One, because that is mentioned in one of the textbooks. The more personal the knowledge and understanding is, the more convincing and interesting the discussion will be. And that leads us on to consider how can the students help themselves prepare for this before they do their actual exam. So researching their themes to get their AO4 material. Google.de is a great starting point. We're not talking about the same level of research as for their IRP. It involves short research tasks that they could undertake once a week, or again, if they're allowed to use their phones, you could set them one to do while you're arriving at the lesson. So use search engine prompts such as Wie denken die Deutschen über plus a particular subtheme, or a subtheme plus the word Meinung, so Rassismus, Meinung, can again give them lots of information, and they can mention, Deutschland, Österreich, Schweiz, whatever. Welche Rolle spielt, warum ist es so wichtig, and so on. Okay, and what they can then do is build those up, and my students have an exercise book with a few pages for each sub-theme. So every time they found something out, they made a note of it. They'll build up an AO4 portfolio that they can then, if you like, learn prior to the exam. It can be a weekly assignment. Students could perhaps do it as a little show and tell at the end of a lesson, for example, or like I say, they could perhaps do that at the beginning of the lesson while they're waiting for you to arrive. So the last section then, the individual research project. Just going to refer to this question. Someone's just asked there, why are there no changes to A-level speak in the light of COVID-19? That was an off-call decision. I'm afraid that's nothing that I can sort of reply to, I'm afraid. So the individual research project. So AQA's NEA advisors for MFL have already produced a teacher's guide which centres should have received via their exam officers. If you've not had that, get in touch with the MFL team at AQA and they will ensure that you get sent that out. It contains valuable information and guidance about all aspects of the IRP. It doesn't, however, replace the team of advisors, so it's extra support, but your titles that you are proposing to use should be submitted for approval from the advisors. And certainly in 2019, there was a lot of schools didn't do this. So once you've got your titles, send them to your advisor. You can find out from MFL who that is. And if there's any uncertainty as whether the title will provide enough AO4 material for the presentation and the ensuing 9 to 10 minute discussion, this will be flagged up. Or indeed, if the topic is too broad, I've had technology in Switzerland for one, it was far too broad to get any sort of in-depth discussion going. And those titles can go backwards and forwards from the advisor until the advisor gets something that both you and they are happy with, if you like. The research carried out should be wide enough in scope to allow for AO4 content in both the presentation and the discussion. To date, a number of students have concentrated their research on the presentation and then have had a little or no extra knowledge and understanding to bring to the discussion. And this can lead to a repetition of material in both the presentation and the discussion, which then affects the mark awarded. Or the teacher runs out of material and then moves on to discussing the same topic, if you like, within England, or in fact the student's personal experience. And again, that doesn't attract those AO4 marks. So within the presentation, their content must focus on the key findings of their research. The content must be rooted in a German-speaking society, and anything that isn't will compromise the AO4. The presentation isn't an opportunity for students to say what they would like to, intend to, or are going to discuss in the discussion. It should look back on the research carried out and not look forward to the discussion. If you share the mark scheme and its amplification that I'm going to show you on the next 3 slides with your students, they will have a clear understanding of what is expected. So their presentation needs to show thorough knowledge and understanding of the area of study, and that has got to be shown in that 2 minutes of presentation. Okay, so a presentation that demonstrates the student has fully understood and assimilated research-based knowledge through the development in the time available of key findings, that will show thorough knowledge. Okay, and that goes down through good knowledge, reasonable knowledge, the briefest outline of key findings with little development and showing little understanding and assimilation of research-based knowledge would characterize a very limited performance. And an example of something like that might be the student who's decided to look at football in Germany, for example, but spend a long time talking about the fact that they started playing football when they were 7 because they really enjoyed it and they were a fan of Sheffield United, but they also like watching German football and they like Bayern Munich and their favourite, etc., etc. I mean, it's very exaggerated example there, but that's showing very little of their own research. Okay. So the IRP discussion. So within the IRP discussion, the AO4 knowledge isn't just about factual knowledge. So the mark scheme descriptors make this clear. They need to be able to select relevant information and evidence to support their arguments and justify their conclusions, and then show an evaluation of the chosen topic. And for that reason, we often encourage centres to have their title as a question. So the title of their IRP, written in English, as a question. So how dangerous are AFD, for example? Okay, something like that, and then that leads them automatically to evaluating. Students can only do this, so select the information to support their arguments and their conclusions if they are asked the right questions. So on the next few slides, we've just got some question types and better, if you like, questioning techniques. So on the left, you've got some examples of asking for factual knowledge. So, and you can see 3 out of the 4 of them, 3 of them are what questions, and then we've got a yes/no answer. Okay, so what type of families are there in Germany, Austria, Switzerland? A better question to ask them to use the knowledge that they've accrued while doing their research is, how is family structure changing in Germany, Austria or Switzerland, and is this a good thing? So then they can talk about what they found out, but then you're going to say, is this a good thing? So then they're using what they found out to evaluate and explain whether they think it's good or not. Okay, so again, the most important use of digital technology, an alternative, how has it changed? So how, why, what would the impact be? What do you think? Rather than yes, no's, or just what, eliciting that factual information. Again, which German festivals do you know about? Could be better, in your opinion. What's the value of traditional festivals? They'll still tell you what festival they know about, but then they will go on to explain how important that is for that town, area, region, whatever. Again, you can see what, when, all factual things. Okay, so rather than when was it built, why is it important to remember the events? So they can still say when it was built, and then they can explain why it was built, and then why it's important. Okay, in Austria, where do immigrants come from? So again, a basic factual question, but change that. Why do people want to come and live in Austria? So again, they can talk about where they've come. They can compare that to what Austria is sort of making available, is offering to those immigrants, and whether it should be encouraged. What is AFD? Do you think that AFD is dangerous, and why? And again, they can refer to the fact of what the AFD have done, and then explain whether they think that is dangerous or not. Okay, so lots of things. Why do you think? What is your opinion of? To what extent? Okay, again, what aspects of politics are German young people in Germany interested in, rather than just a yes/no question of, are they interested in politics? Okay, so hopefully you can see, think about what questions you're going to ask. Is that just eliciting factual knowledge, or is it getting them to use that knowledge to explain or evaluate something? Okay, so that concludes the A-level fundamental skills focus of this webinar. Just like to remind you of the support that's on the AQA website. Extra resources in the plan, teach and assess sections of the website. Can I also encourage you you to use the examiner's reports that are either on AQA or EAQA, depending on which paper you're looking at. They are vital sources of information that explain why students were given certain marks, what was accepted, what wasn't accepted, and it can inform your own teaching a lot about what you need to improve with your own students. Okay. You can get in touch with the AQA team either on the phone between 8 and 4, by email or via Twitter, and they were more than happy to answer any questions that you may have. Okay. Well, that brings us to the end of the presentation. Thank you for joining me for this AQA training today. I'll hand you back to Inset Online shortly so they can talk you through downloading the post-event materials. Before I do, please can I ask you to let us have your feedback on today's training, which should only take you a couple of minutes. This is really important to me as your trainer and to AQA and Inset Online in ensuring the quality of these online training sessions. I'll hand you back to Inset Online now so that they can explain how to complete the electronic feedback form. Thanks for your attention and keep safe and have a pleasant evening.
Thank you, Kathy, for today's training and to all of you for participating today. Please stay online to download your post-event materials and leave your feedback. To download materials, look for the Post-Event Materials pod at the bottom of your screen. Click on the file, then click on the button to download files. Nothing will happen in this screen, but if you look in your web browser you should see a prompt to download. The online room stays open for 15 minutes after we close if you need it to download materials. If you don't download materials today, your next chance will be when materials are posted on the Secure Key Materials area of the AQA website at the end of the series. Finally, please let us have your feedback using the online form, which you should see on screen now. If it hasn't opened automatically, look for the linked feedback window at the top of the screen, then click on the long link in that pod. When you are ready, close the window to exit. On behalf of AQA, thank you for being online today.